Hi, I'm Gary and welcome to my Outdoors channel. This video is about RC aircraft, and this one in particular is about doing the floats on the Horizon Timber airplane. This is very easy to change out and do, and you can probably change this out between floats and wheels within about 15 minutes once you learn the process. This is one of the first airplanes anybody has come out with where we can make quick and easy changes between wheels and floats. Now this is just a video on putting together the floats on this airplane. There's a lot of great videos on this already on how to do a build and assembly on this, but I only found like one other one that covered the subject of putting the floats together. The instructions that come with this are pretty vague and difficult to follow, but being that I have a fairly good mechanical aptitude, I was able to figure it out. But I figured, hey, if I had trouble with it, I should help you guys learn how to do this too. So stay tuned, I'll show you how I do this and how easy it is. The parts that this comes with is the two pontoons, two cross members that'll connect between these two pontoons. Then we've got two support members that will go from the rear of the pontoon up to the bottom of the airplane itself. Then we have the front and rear struts. Now the front strut has a sharper angle to it than the rear one does, if you can see that here. Also, there are some screws that come with this. Now, the screws that came for the rear rudder lines, I noticed they were kind of loose when I got this put together. So I took those two screws out and saved them in a small Ziploc bag here. Then the landing gear screws, I made up a Ziploc bag to put those in for when I take the wheels off so I can keep track of them and know what they're for. And then for the pontoons, there's just these two extra screws we'll need for mounting the pontoons on, which partially will be for the support members here. But the first step is going to be removing the landing gear from the fuselage here so we can put these pontoons on. I'll show you how I do that. My first task here is going to be removing the landing gear here so I can put the floats on. Now in dealing with some of these screws, some of them are very small, some of them are a little bit bigger. I always try to use the largest screwdriver bit that I can in a screw to make it easier to get a good grasp on it. And that makes a big difference in how well things go together for you or come apart. So my first task is going to be to remove these two screws here that hold these springs in place. Then there's four other screws here that hold these wheel frames in place. So I remove these. These are bigger screws, so I'm going to use like a number 2 bit. Then as I take these screws out, I'm going to save them for later use, and to avoid confusion, I'll put them into some Ziploc bags that I've got marked for other use. Now these here, I'll take these 4 out for the wheel frames. Then I'll get these other 2 out too, then I can take this assembly apart. Okay, the 4 screws that I took out for these wheel frames here, I won't be using those on the pontoons for the mounting. But these 2 screws I took out for these springs here, I will be using for mounting the pontoons. So I'll be keeping those separate and apart and putting the other ones away in some Ziploc bags that are labeled so I know what they're for when I want to put this back together again. So now these just pull apart here and these wheels come off. And I can set them aside. My next step here is I'm going to assemble the pontoons so I can mount them onto the fuselage here. Here I'm going to assemble these pontoon parts together, and what I'll be putting together is these crossbars on the rear and the front. Now one thing to note is the orientation of these pontoons. These decals go on the outside. So this is the front, this is the rear. I have the rudders on the rear here. Also, what I'll be putting on is the struts for the pontoons, and the struts go into the fuselage of the airplane. First thing we need to do is we have these 4 float plates on here that we need to take off these pontoons. And these are going to hold in place the crossbars and the struts. This takes the small Phillips screwdriver. Now I'm going to separate these a little bit of a distance here so I can get these cross members in. And what they do is they insert into these holes on the inside of the pontoon here. So they'll insert like this. Then the hole lines up with the hole for the screw inside there. And that's what these will go back into to screw down and hold these cross members on each side. Additionally, these are going to cover over where these go in. So these set in like that, and they kind of set down flush into this. Then these will cover over that to hold that in place as such. And that'll screw down and hold her tight. Get this other one lined up. Actually, line up the front rear one here too. Then put on the other side of the pontoon. Kind of gently guide it in so that everything lines up good. Pretty much you can press them all away until they stop. Then kind of look at the holes, make sure they're lining up with the screw hole they got to go into. Now one note to make is these are a machine thread screw. Machine thread screw means that there is like a steel thread on the inside of the hole here that these have to go into. So when you get these started, you don't want to cross thread it, otherwise you're going to create some problems for yourself. Make it very difficult for assembly. So when you start, you might want to set that in, and as you go in with the screwdriver, first maybe go backwards a little bit as if you were loosening it, until you can feel it catch a little bit and drop into place, and then go forward. And as long as that goes easily enough, it should not be real difficult. As long as it goes easily enough, then you're in the correct thread. So that's something to be careful about so you don't cross thread things. Otherwise, it could be issues. I don't know how replacing threads inside of these would be very easy. Okay, so we got these. Next we have to put on the struts. And the way the struts work, I've got them marked front and rear. They set into these holes as such. Kind of work it to get it all the way in there. And get it seated all the way down. And the same with the rear one. It goes in those holes here. And both of these struts lean inward towards each other. So one doesn't go forward and the other one doesn't go backwards. They both lean in towards the center of the fuselage of the airplane. I will get these float plates in place here and get them secured. Now I tighten these, I just snug them. Don't want to muscle down on them too hard because you may break whatever's holding them inside there, because it's only some plastic that's really holding the threaded part on the inside. So you don't want to over torque it and wind up breaking it. Okay, so I've got those on there, so they both tilt towards the center. Next, I'm going to put the support members on, and they'll run from this inside hole on this plate, so we'll screw onto there, And we want to make sure that these have angles on them. One's angling up, the other one's angling down. Want to get this so it screws on to this one, but then this one here comes up underneath the strut here, because this will be going into a hole on the fuselage, and this screw and this support member here is going to hold the strut into place in the fuselage. So this uses the same two size screws that are extras that came with it, that are the same as the springs on that landing gear. Now for these screws, I'll use the larger Phillips screwdriver. I want to carefully make sure I get this positioned correctly. Now these kind of screws here are more like wood screws, a much coarser thread. So you want to be careful on getting the thread started on these too. It's like first time you ever put these screws in, you're forming or cutting the threads for these screws. When you go to put them back in again, you want to try and make sure you catch and find that same thread again, so you're not stripping out or creating new threads, which are going to weaken everything. Get the screw inserted on this, so I can get this one started. Again, I'm kind of trying to make sure I'm getting a catch on the correct thread there. Should go easily, should not be real difficult unless you're cutting the thread for the first time. And of course I want to make sure I've got this underneath the strut up here when I do that assembly. I get these snug, but not totally tight yet, because I'm going to need to move them around a little bit when I attach this to the fuselage. This is pretty much the assembly as far as these pontoons go. One little tweak I'm going to show you is in regards to these rudders on the back part here and how they work. I've worked on one here already to make sure it's kind of loose and easy to work. This other one is still quite stiff, doesn't move real freely. So you want to make these to work freely so that they steer as they should, because these are some very tiny springs. They're not very strong springs here. And when I'm working on these things, of course, I disconnect these springs from this rudder arm, and it stays attached here with this screw here. But another thing I'll do with these springs is to check and make sure that these screws are tight in there. Not totally tight, but pretty snug to give the spring ability to move a little bit, because when these arms move, that's going to change a little bit of the pitch or position on this spring. You don't want it binding up, because then that could restrict the movement on the rudders. So anyways, I'm going to take this other one apart here, and I'll show you what I did to make it work freely. First thing, other than disconnecting the spring, and I'm going to make a cutout here, make sure I got a good focus on this. Okay, for kind of tweaking or tuning up these rudders so they move freely. This one doesn't, this one does pretty easily. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the small Phillips screwdriver and a razor knife for doing some shaving of the plastic parts here. There's some seams and so forth from the plastic molding that kind of creates some restriction in how this moves. So I will remove the screw from the top here. So I've got that all the way loose, and take the screw out. Now this arm for the steering here comes off, and there's a square shape inside of here, and there's a square shape on top of this. That's what makes the rudder turn. Now this just drops out like that, and you can see the shaft to it and the square shape on the head there on this arm. Now there's some seams on the back side here and on the front side too. What I'm going to do is take my razor blade here and just kind of scrape it. Yeah, not cut it much, but just scrape it, and I rotate a little bit so I can try and get somewhat. And there's a little bit of a shoulder here on the top part, and there's a little bit of a seam on that too, so you want to get some of that off of there too. Then on the back side here, same thing. A little bit of a shoulder there to clean off. And then just scraping some of this plastic off of there to shave it down a little bit. Then something else I noticed too is when this is in here, this rubs fairly closely to the back side of the pontoon here, to the front end of this part here for this rudder. This one's not so bad as the other one was, but depending on what you got, what I do is I take this part here and I'll shave a little bit off of that also. Doesn't take a lot, just a little bit. You want to go a little bit at a time and kind of keep tweaking it until you've got a good fit that operates as it should. Blow off some of the shavings. Okay, so I can kind of hold that. That seems to work pretty freely now, whereas before it was quite stiff. So I'll put this arm back on again, and the fish line on this is always going to be on the outside of the pontoon here. Put the screw back in, snug that down. Now I want to kind of get this snug so it's not too loose here. Not a lot of slack moving up and down, but I want this to move freely here. Back it off just a tad. Can get a little bit of restriction there yet. That's not too bad. I think I could tweak this a little bit more. So I'm going to take this apart and shave it a little bit more. Then I'll cut back in here again. Okay, so that's working a lot better now, a lot more freely. And that'll make it a lot easier for these rudders to work while you're out on the water. And you also notice how these rudders will, if you hit something, they go up like this so you can clear it. It won't break your rudders. Okay, so much for that tweak. Now, next step I'm going to do is to mount these onto the fuselage of the airplane. Before I take these over and mount these onto the fuselage, I need to reconnect these springs here to these rudder arms. Now I think, if I remember right, when these came, these springs were connected to the second hole in on this rudder arm. You have the furthest hole out, then a second hole in, then there's just a little slot for the fish line to fit through and so forth and tie up. What I'm going to do to give myself more strength on how these pull, because these are going to be pulling this direction to the tail rudder control, so that means it's always going to be pulling against that, and then it needs to be able to pull itself back in order to do this other angle for steering. So I'm going to attach this spring hook to the furthest hole out to give me what I consider to be better control. So I get a grip on this with these precision needle nose pliers and hook that into that hole on this rudder arm. Alright, so I got that in there. That'll give it really good control. And same with this one on this side. Okay, so it's wanting to pull these kind of like club-footed in a way here on both of these. And once we connect these to the tail parts, that's going to straighten these so they're straight up. That way we can pull that way to steer that way and let it loose enough and it steers the other way. Alright, so I've got the fuselage upside down here. I've got it turned at kind of an angle here so I can kind of work around this tail here and have space and try and give you a good view of what's going on here. I've got this one plate back here I need to take off for the rear strut on these floats, and it's just here all the time. Just a good place to store it, I guess. Here's the number 2 Phillips screwdriver, and this just pops off. Sometimes, there we go. Now, I'm going to take the floats, turn them upside down, and the fronts of the floats are pointing up this way. The rear has the rudders on them. And these angles here, both the front and the rear, slip into these holes. This one's just right behind the button for the battery compartment here. And it's just kind of pressing it down so it slips down into there. Then the rear one, that presses and slips down into there. Then we put this back on the rear. And this has got a shape to it where it's got a flat edge here and it's got a pointy edge here. The pointy edge kind of goes towards the rear, or towards the tail of the airplane. And the blade to this goes down inside the hole to hold that piece of frame down there. Then I'll put these two screws in. Make sure I get a good straight start on the screw. Get that in a little bit loosely, get the other screw started. I always like to get all the screws started loosely and in place before I tighten them down. Of course, if there's any alignment with any holes or issues, I want to be able to adjust that. That's in there snug. Now I just need the other two screws that are normally used for holding those springs off the landing gear. So I got these from my little packet of screws that I've saved. And these are these arms here that I told you about before that are going to fit over these front strut. The screw will go into here and into this hole on this body here. And that holds that strut in place there. Got that in there loosely. Get the other one here. Sometimes you got to press a little bit, get the correct alignment on that. Okay. So that one's tight. Go back and tighten this one a little bit. Okay, so basically that's about it. The only other thing I'm going to do is to turn this back around and come back and tighten down this screw here on top of the pontoon for that support rod. Okay. Now, one other thing to do. Let me cut out and make sure I got a good focus on this. Okay, back here on the rudder is where we've got this bracket assembly here that these pins for the floats goes in that little hole there. Then you've got this tiny little screws that I took out before and saved that thread into this, and we'll hold these in place. I kind of try to snug them while holding onto that without bending things too much. Same with this side. Get this in here, get the screw started in there to hold the rod. What I'm going to do is adjust this, get the tail straight. Might have to make some adjustment on this. Well, yeah, actually the rudder does hold straight with that now. This one, I got to put the spring back on it. Okay, got that spring on that one. I kind of take a look at my rudders here, make sure they're good and straight. Then adjust these pins in and out on these to make sure things are straight. Of course, make sure my tail rudder here is straight so I can adjust the rudders on the floats. And then that's pretty much it. This is pretty well complete, apart from not having the wing on top yet. Working on things, you know, having the wing off just makes it a lot easier, and you're not wangling around as much of a large object. Also, if you're ever going to do anything with the battery and so forth, I always recommend you take off the prop before you do that, in case you get any accidental starts or something, you're not going to lose a finger. So we've got the floats put on, we've got the rudders working so they steer it. So that'll work great. Can't wait to get out on the lake and try this out. Now, like I said, I'm not going to do a demonstration at the lake for taking off and landing on water. There's so many videos out there already on this that cover that topic pretty well. I would recommend that when you do go to the lake to do some flying with this, if you're going to use the pontoons, double check all your screws, make sure they're all snug, and you'll have a lot of fun. Well, I guess this really wouldn't be complete if I didn't show you how to put the wheels back on this and take these pontoons off. So I'm going to turn this around, hopefully give you a good view of this. And for taking these pontoons off, there's not as much as what we went through for assembly. I got this back part here where I'm going to take this plate out that holds the rear strut in place. Just 2 screws to take that off. Then I'll remove the plate, and then I'll put the plate and the 2 screws back on again, because it just makes a good sensible place to keep these parts at. Then I have to take these 2 screws off in the front here for these supports. These are also the same screws that hold the landing gear springs in place. But also, another thing I have to do is to disconnect these rods or pins from the rear part here for the steering. Then I'm also going to take these screws out of this back here, because they're such tiny screws and easy to lose. I'm going to take those out and save those in a Ziploc bag so that they don't rattle loose or something. Now these pontoons just pop out of these brackets, and I can set these aside. Then I can take this wheel assembly again, put it back on. These flares kind of point towards the rear of the airplane, and just kind of spread apart and slip into there. Then I find these 4 small machine screws that I had saved from before, and I'll put these back in to hold these wheel brackets on. Snug those down well. Then I'll put these screws back in for these wheel springs. And we've got the landing gear back together again. Then I'll put this part back on here that was covering up and holding the rear strut of the pontoons, or the floats. And we're ready to take off again off of land. Well, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you got the inspiration and learned how to install the floats on your timber airplane. If you did, please give me a like and share it with your family, friends, and fellow outdoors persons. Also, please subscribe and be sure to hit that bell icon so you won't miss out on anything. I also greatly appreciate all your comments. I learn a lot of good information from you and get a lot of great ideas from you. If the ladies don't find you handsome, at least they should find you handy. Thank you.